Concentrate. Okay. Well, so yeah, indeed. First of all, thank you very much for having me here. Maybe I should give my credentials for being here. Well, I am one of the co-founders of Quividi, which is a French company in automated audience measurement. But probably the best credential I have is that Andrea and I go back a long way, and he invited me, knew me from my EPFL days as a PhD student. And when he called me to ask me whether I could come here, he said, well, just doesn't matter what you talk about, just be your usual cynical self, because I'm kind of known to be a bit cynical. I realized after giving him provisional title for my presentation, that's actually very easy to be cynical about startup and startup efforts. Just the other day, I was reading the paper, and there was this Dilbert strip, a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to leave it on the screen for 5 seconds before the copyright notice kicks in. But basically, you see, it's very easy to make fun of people that have ideas. So I got a little bit, self-conscious about it and say, well, I shouldn't be so cynical. Maybe I should just try to share with you the kind of information that maybe I wish I had known in advance. And the title of the talk, Stuck in the Chasm, we will see in more detail later on where it comes from. It's talking about what happens when you start your company and you haven't really been successful yet, but you're not dead yet. So what do you do? How do you recognize what you need to do and what needs to be done in order to move to the next step? So let's start with some broad observation, and then I will focus on my personal experience. We've all heard the meme, 90% of technical startup will fail. That's what the Dilbert strip is all about. And certainly there is some truth to that. But if we look a little bit more in detail at what happens to startup, and we look at liquidation rates for startups, you see that, yes, we have 25% of technical startups fold in the first year, and then that percentage rate climbs to 36% in the second year, 44% in the third, and 55% in year 4. But that means that, if you start a startup and you do your job well, you have a pretty good chance of still being alive after 5 years. So what is really failure? How do we measure that? Or alternatively, how do we measure success? And in startup lore, success is always measured with pretty generous terms, like either you have an IPO with high return, or you have an acquisition with high value, like 40 million plus, you have an enormous capitalization or an ginormous customer base, in the case of social networks, for instance. But that's only part of the story. If you consider some standard figures, like in the US, for instance, every year there are 500,000 new businesses created from scratch. Now this, of course, covers the entire spectrum of business, so we go from bakeries to pet shops. But let's assume that 0.5% of these businesses are tech companies related to technology in some way. And if you apply the figures that I showed you before about liquidation rates, that means that every year at least 1,000 technical startups are born that will have a life expectancy of 5 years or more. So there's a lot of businesses that are, well, if you compare 5 years to the average length of a relationship or a marriage in the US, we're still in the same ballpark, right? So it's not negligible. And what I'm trying to say is that there are a lot of untold stories. You hear about Facebook, Google, success stories that are very close to, say, the story of someone that wins the lottery. And then you have, at the other extremes, the cautionary tales like Pets.com, $300 million burning 260 deaths, right? But the bulk of the startup stories is in the middle. And these are companies that are active, they're working, they're doing their thing. And you don't really hear about them very much. Where are these companies? And that's where the chasm comes into being. So there's this book, this famous book published originally in 1991 by Jeffrey Moore. The title is Crossing the Chasm. And the vision that Moore had, this description of the business world, which applied not just to businesses, but to any disruptive idea, is that there are a clear distinction in, if you think of this curve as the percentage of your customers, the distribution of your customer base, in case of a company, you'll always have what are called the visionaries and the early adopters that make a small percentage of your total customer base. Those are easy to get. If your idea is not really crappy, if there is some merit to it, although it might be impractical or it will not stand the test of time, But you will always find someone that believes in you or that gives you a chance. These are the early adopters, the visionaries, that will give you the initial fuel to launch a business. The bulk of your customers comes later. These are the pragmatists. These are people that wait and see until the idea has been validated or the model has been validated, followed by the conservatives, who come even later, and finally the skeptics. But there is a gap, there is a chasm between the early adopters, that gives you the initial enthusiasm, and the bulk of your customers. And the real challenge for a company or for an idea is to cross this chasm, to move from the pioneers to the masses. And I posit that there is a very large number of startup companies that have good ideas and that are stuck in the chasm. They're doing their job and they're still struggling with this bridging between the initial successes, which are very gratifying for your ego and for your job satisfaction in the beginning. So you start from there, but you have to go to large adoptions. How you get there, well, every story is a different story, and that's where we move to maybe more particular observations about my experience and my company. So the company is called Quividi, and the story is rather simple. It's related a little bit to what you guys are doing here at the Intelligent Sensing School. So in 2006, when we started, me and my co-founders, intelligent sensing was a technology in search of the market, so especially vision, you had a lot of algorithms, and I would like to say that this company did not start in academia. We were engineers working for another company that went belly up, and we found ourselves with some pretty good algorithms that we had developed, and we wanted to start some business around those algorithms. So we had some vision code that worked pretty well. It was, of course, a prototype, and so we sat around the table and said, okay, what is the market, for instance, for something like object tracking, face recognition, and so on and so forth. What appeared to us in 2006 was that digital signage was starting to become big. Digital signage is fundamentally, well, these screens that you have here in the room, if they were in a public place, they would be called digital signage. Most of the business around digital signage is, of course, acts on advertisement. Advertisement company buy time on public screens, just like they buy airtime on TV channels. The question is, nobody knows how many people are looking at the screens, and so nobody knows how to price the airtime on public screens. This was the clear need. So people were just estimating very indirectly the audience or the footfall for public locations. So we thought that by applying intelligent sensing to these screens, we could actually give actionable metrics to people that were selling time on the screens, really bringing the TV audience measurement paradigm to public spaces. The key idea was that there was a natural synergy between both the infrastructure and the computing power that is usually associated to, say, kiosks that show advertisement or players on public screens. So if we developed software that was smart and light enough, we could piggyback on the existing infrastructure and become a software company that would disseminate its product on the market. So this is, some of the videos that we had at the beginning. When people turn their faces towards the screen, they're counted. So you do that with face detection. Then you try to classify gender according to where they're turning. It's like attention time versus dwell time. A series of metrics that are of relevance to advertisers and media companies. Then, of course, we added other algorithms, classic overhead counting. These are things that you've seen inside out. So I'm not going to bore you with videos about that. Of course, once you have a bag of algorithms in your pocket, you're just like 10% of the way to a product, because there's commercialization, of course, but there's also the concept of service. When you talk, especially to, when you have a technological solution that you try to sell to people that are not technological at all, like media companies, you can't afford to do tech speak. You're not going to seduce them with your success rate and face recognition. You have to build a system around, and you have to talk their language. So we started to develop vocabulary for metrics. I'm not going to go through the details here, but basically you want to build a package, and also you want to build a service so that people can use this data easily. So the workflow is typically like this. You start with a camera that you put in a public place. You have a software block that does all the image processing and the image analysis to create these metrics. And then you have to import this matrix into a data warehouse. So we have big servers that are collecting data from the main endpoints, and this helps selling the service because the data warehouse does also data organization for the customer, so the customer simply logs in on their interface and they see the attendance figures and the attention figures for their chain of stores directly in the web interface. So they get their reports weekly or monthly, so they can go to their boss and show what the return on investment is. We also use the local data that is generated at the screen to for instance, trigger the content. And it's easy to imagine if you have a population that is composed mostly of women, you want to show advertisement that is targeted to that particular audience. And then you do proof of performance, and then you can integrate these other things. I'm not going to go into the minute details of what we do, but you see that there's one block here that is the algorithmic part of the job, and all the rest is software as a service, is data handling, system administration, user interface. So the academic part or the smart part is not that dominant when you actually have to sell a full package service. So again, we offer a software solution, we offer a service in terms of reports, and we offer also appliances for people that don't have in-house IT teams that can integrate the solution. Make sure I can go over time. So if I sum up what the company is today, we started in 2006, which is a long time ago. As you can see, we haven't made the headlines yet, but if you look in the press, you see there's a lot of big brother-ish kind of alarmist press out there. We recently opened an office in Silicon Valley just a couple of months ago, because of course we need a US presence, especially to create a customer base there, and we're privately funded. Our technology DNA, you have seen, is video processing fundamentally, intelligent sensing. And we have about 250 customers in 45 countries around the world, and 8 regional resellers that sell our solution globally. Okay? So let's stop for a second, do a checkpoint, and see what I think we did right. Is the fact that we're still alive, we're still selling, we're break even, if you want. And what we might have done differently, in the sense that we, widen the chasm between our initial success and the present situation. So we were a solid team of founders and wrote what I think is great code that stood the test of time. We were very careful with the funding. There's a lot of, we can talk about this later, but especially in Europe, there's a lot of sharkish, what I call, institutional funds that will really like to take the bulk of your equity for very little money, so you have to be careful and play your cards smartly. So we managed to do that and keep most of the equity. But at the same time, what allowed us to live, for instance, especially in France, it's very easy to get a lot of grants from the government because you're creating a new company, you're creating a new employment. So they're rather generous, which is great, but at the same time, it shields you a little bit from the realities of the market. Because you're living off grants a little bit, so you're not really challenged in terms of sales and actual marketability. So people say sometimes you have to fail fast in order to verify the goodness of an idea, and if you get this grant, probably you can live in a sort of illusory situation for a little bit longer than you should. Hopefully that's not our case. And again, we tightened our belts a lot in the sense we didn't pay ourselves much. We didn't pay ourselves market standards. This could be good in the beginning, but if you do it for too long, again, you're putting yourself outside of market reality. So you have to double check that, because it doesn't really make sense to do that for too long. It becomes an artificial survival. So my advice, according to the first checkpoint, is that when you found a team, you have to think in terms of sailboat. Like imagine spending 3 years in the same boat with the same people. So you have to make sure that these are people you can actually live in close quarters with for a long time. And whatever you do, even if you think that your co-founders are your best friends, put it in writing. Because down the line, all sorts of things can happen. When you do funding, no venue is beneath you. You have to really walk around, pitch, as Joshua was saying, everywhere. Sometimes you find yourself in VC rounds, you don't know why you're there, but you just do it anyway because you never know when the opportunity can knock. Beware of this, it sounds an oxymoron, but I've really had institutional venture capitalists tell me, we don't like risk. Well, so why are you a venture capitalist? So there are people like that, and they try to compensate for the risk by taking equity, which I think is a suicidal strategy, but it's just my opinion. And keep most of the equity for the second round if you can. And realism is, of course, pay yourself reasonably, treat your company as a real company from the start, and beware of vanity metrics. Measure your success in terms of real, tangible qualities, not the ego boost of maybe an one-off sale. So I don't know how much time I have. Maybe 5 minutes or so. Okay, so I will not go into too many details of what are our customers, but maybe it's interesting to you to know that if you go to a Tesco petrol station, you're probably going to be counted as a customer, and the software behind is our software. So we have deal with Amscreen. We're equipping most of the petrol stations in the UK. They use this measure to target their ad campaign according to a predefined number of users. It's a sort of a AdWords for, although of course it doesn't have the same targeting granularity of AdWords, but similar concept to on-screen advertisement in chains of gas stations in this case. Always in the UK we've had a deal with Ocean Outdoor where we had a large screen measured and the content targeted to the people that were moving around. And probably better for the karma, a few campaign with Clear Channel where the content on the screen was changed according to whom I should say, was looking at the screen. In particular, there were a couple of campaigns that had strong social awareness content. There was a campaign that was targeted as awareness about violence, domestic violence, and so if a man was looking at the screen, there was a picture of a woman that would actually sort of protect herself. So it was very impactful, to use a marketing term. So these are some of the cases. We have customers both in the software world, content management system publishers that help handle the content on screens, hardware manufacturers that want to integrate this kind of sensing technology into their boxes that they push for digital signage, and of course research agencies that actually are in the data primarily. This is our presence in our largest networks in the world, so you see we're trying to touch as many continents and countries as we can. And so if I were to sum up the key figures today for Quividi is that we have 10,000 measurement points across 45 countries, and in our database we have over 1 billion records of individual viewers qualified in terms of gender, age bracket, and attention time and dwell time for each of these measurement points that we have in the world. So, okay, I mean, I'm not giving you a term of comparison, but this is a pretty good number. So why are still in the chasm, in the chasm? So here's the second checkpoint. I think that we were right in doing a certain number of things, like from the start set up a network of indirect sales, so as to give most of the responsibility for the marketing, outsource most of the responsibility for the marketing, resisted the featureitis that is like the scourge of many technical companies. Customer calls you, asks for a feature. You as an engineer are all excited about writing some new code that implements this cool new feature, and then you end up with an unmanageable code base or an unmanageable product. So resisted this feature request and offered a product that was clear and stable. And also, we were also very nice to all our customers, and that really plays well in the long run. There's a lot of companies that come off as grading, so you want to be a nice guy. At the same time, of course, out of budget reason, we accepted probably some subpar deals that drove us a little bit off course. But of course, at the end of the day, you have to balance that budget. So deal comes in, you cannot refuse it, and you may lose time or energy or steam. And we were a little bit naive with respect to the dynamics of business. You know, the world is not meritocratic. It is important to know people. It is important to talk to the right people and do the right things that maybe are not particularly meaningful from a technical point of view, but they're more meaningful in terms of network and further advantages down the line. So the advice, again, that I can derive from these checkpoints is that marketing is important. We're engineers. We tend to have this Dilbert syndrome, you know, to sort of look down on marketing people, but they are actually instrumental to the success of the company. So embrace them from the start, and don't be emotional in your pricing. Both ways, right? Not too cheap, not too expensive. It's very hard to get a good price point, but it's key to make it in the long run. As far as today you cannot act locally, so you have to think immediately from an international point of view. So open up immediately to local representatives that will try to sell your product abroad. You cannot handle it all on your own. It's difficult culturally and also from the point of view of the time zones. You don't want to get up every morning at 4 because you have to talk to Australia. And if you want to sell in the US, you have to be there. So if you want to sell in the US, you have to be there. So you open your US subsidiary as soon as you can. And no startup is an island. You have to schmooze with people that matter. And I know it's hard to do. It's not in the DNA of an engineer or most engineers, but it's important. So why is Quividi still in the chasm? I think there are 4 scenarios here, and the future will depend entirely on which scenario we're in, but it's hard to tell. So the first possibility is that we have a good idea, but we're ahead of the market. So the market's not ready for that. So you can hope that the market catches up, and we've been doing that since 2006. The problem is that it seems that the market is catching up, but at that point you have some baggage, and fresh newcomers are coming to the forefront with much more energy than you. I mean, you have experience, but they have the pack of the newcomers. So it puts you a little bit at a disadvantage. Also, with respect to investors, you're not the fresh face at the table. So there's advantages and inconveniences to being experienced in the field. But this is really the best scenario, because the alternative is that the idea is good, but the market is intrinsically small. So you will never be that success story because you cannot have a large customer base. And there, the only hope you have is that you pivot, like in the Dilbert strip, until you find the idea that opens you that market. Hopefully the experience and the team you have built up gives you a starting point that is much better than starting from scratch. The first scenario is that the idea is good, but the marketing is bad. And again, there you have to be humble and embrace marketing. That, of course, it sounds like BS most of the time, what marketing people say, but it actually makes a difference. The worst case is that you have had a bad idea, but not terrible. This is really the really trickiest part. Because if the idea is terrible, then you die. But if the idea is bad but not terrible, you will always have enough early adopters or pioneers, and there will be actually an intrinsic, natural change in this basis of pioneers. So you will always have the hope that you're still in that first phase and you're just about to cross the chasm, but it's not going to happen. In which case, Dogbert, I think, is right. So let's hope that's case A, and we'll see, I think, in a few moments. So thank you, and have questions.
Any quick questions for Paolo at this point before we move over to the panel discussion? Yes.
Sorry. So one question is that you were saying about paying yourself very fairly. So I wanted to know if can you actually live, reach in the loft in the center, but can you actually make a living while the startup picks up? Can you, because people have family. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, that's really. I would ask in 2 steps. There's the first step is like, should I do this? Should I start a startup? Of course, there's going to be some sacrifice, and if you have family and kids, it's difficult. It's very difficult. But in answering that question, you should provision for a decent living, because otherwise, it's not a real company, right? I mean, you can put a little bit of sacrifice in the equation, but not too much. So I'd say yes. I mean, if you want to start a company in London, you have to, in your business plan, you have to have provisions for a decent salary that allows you to live in London. Not seriously, I mean, we're talking, sort of minimum wage-ish. But if you go below that, then you're doing something wrong in business plan.
And final question. So you were talking about sharkish funds and keep yourself equity for the second round.
I mean, some funds would like to take 51% of your equity, right? And that's the worst of possible situations because you've lost the majority. So nobody will want to enter a second round.
So, so my question is, how much is reasonable to say, okay, I want to invest in your idea and I will.
That's a very good question.
Participate with 30%.
It's an impossible question to answer quantitatively because it also depends what the investor brings to the table. It could be a deal where the investor is actually will accompany you in the process and will give you much more than just the cash. At which point you're willing to relinquish more because they will be involved in the process. But some people just want to put the money in, like typically angels or funds that are, an assembly of different investors. There you know that they will not be actively involved. They will just be a pain in the neck at the board meeting, right? So at that point you want to give certainly less than they want. Let's put it this way.
Thank you. John.